What is death? It's a pretty profound question to contemplate. A question that makes us fairly uncomfortable because it puts us into a deep confrontation with a truth that we would rather ignore. And yet, behind our fear and our terror of this concept or this expectation or belief that we hold around death is one of the only certitudes that we actually have in this life. Things will change, and eventually we will die. So it's an incredibly powerful question to start contemplating and wrestling with, as it actually informs so much of the way that we live our lives. Kind of strange to think that we never think about it, or rarely think about it until we're forced to, isn't it? My name's Jasper Brown and welcome to The Conscious Masculine, and in today's episode we're going to be discussing what death is, as well as the profound spiritual significance of this topic. I want to share with you some of my own insights from the recent experience of losing my father. He passed away just over 3 weeks ago. And I really wanted to shoot this episode to share and transmit my own inner process in the hope that it also serves you and helps you to engage with this very profound, very insightful, extremely meaningful topic, in the hope that it helps you shape and deepen your own understanding as it has done for me. So we'll be exploring not only my personal story, but the deep themes and spiritual concepts behind this principle, if we can call it that, as well as how you can find meaning and also develop strategies for relating in a much deeper and more nuanced way with the topic and the theme of death in your life, as it will be an inevitable feature moving forward. We lose more and more people around us as we age, and I've lost quite a number of people in my own life so far. So I have some useful insights and things that I've discovered within myself and my own experiences that I really want to share with you guys. So first, I think a good place to begin is with my own sort of personal journey, since that's something which is very alive for me at the moment. As I've just mentioned, my father has recently passed away. And I've been through an emotional roller coaster and very intense initiatic experience of letting go of the father figure in my life, who has been a continuous pillar since my earliest memories. My dad was always there, always in my life, always a presence, my safety blanket in many ways, my number one fan. And about 6 months ago, he got diagnosed with cancer. And what followed was a very intense period of suffering. Many months spent in the hospital with him, and when he got sick, I was overseas and jumped on the first plane home, and that was Christmas Eve. So the past 5 months have been a very testing, confrontational experience with some of the harsh realities of life. The severance of my own personal attachments, the deep contemplation of the significance of my father's life and the role that he played in my life, as well as the profound emotional impact that that's had on me moving through grief. And I'm still moving through that. Obviously, it's happened quite recently, and there's many stages to that. And also, it's opened up a profound confrontation with the realities of my own life and where I want my life to go and who I want to become and what I really want to achieve. Because when you witness death in front of you with those that you love the most, you are somehow inevitably forced to contemplate your own death. It becomes not just some distant idea that we have in the back of our mind, but more so a harsh reality of an impending truth that we will inevitably have to face. And I watched my father avoiding that truth up until the very end, when eventually it became sort of impossible to avoid. And I took a lot of lessons from this for myself, and understood, some deep nuances. And I think that's really, really worth sharing, because all of us somehow have this avoidance of this truth because it's deeply uncomfortable. It's emotionally taxing. It's disturbing. And I'll dive into the nuances and the psychological mechanisms behind that shortly. Letting go of my father was a really intense experience. He died very suddenly. Although he had cancer, he was given 2 years to live. A week before he passed, he had a massive stroke. Just a week later, and within the same day, he was gone. I was next to him as he died, holding him, watching as his life slipped away. So naturally, that came as a tremendous shock, something which I was preparing for but not expecting so soon. And that's often how these moments catch us, completely unaware, by surprise. And that is a shell-shocking experience when you see someone that you have identified with and connected to and see yourself as being inextricably linked with, to be suddenly ripped away and from one moment to the next, no longer in your life. I can admit that the first emotional reaction was shock and disbelief, followed by profound anguish, pain, and grief. Thankfully, the work that I do and all of the skill sets that I've developed and my deep understanding of emotional intelligence has allowed me to move through and process this experience in a fairly rapid way. I obviously had time to prepare in advance, expecting this was happening, knowing that he was very sick. So I was pre-processing my grief. Contemplating and sitting with and working through the emotional content of this inevitable confrontation that I knew I was going to have, which is a remarkable feature of our system, that it's actually able to digest in a gradual way the inevitable tumultuous situations that we know are coming towards us. So that was interesting, very interesting for me to observe, is that my body, my mind, my emotions were actually preparing me in sort of bite-sized chunks leading up to this moment, because I knew that I was going to lose him from the moment that I heard that he was sick. I didn't know when, but I knew it was inevitable. And that was the first time in my life when it really struck me that I was going to have to say goodbye to him. Not as some abstract idea in the back of my mind, but as a harsh truth that I had to confront now. So this began and triggered a very intense process of pre-grieving. And thankfully, I got to spend a lot of very deep and quality time with him before he passed away. And I got to be by his side and supporting him through the most difficult moment of his life, which is the end. Now, it was very challenging for me, because I saw that he wasn't particularly well prepared for this moment, since he had not worked on his emotional capacities, nor was he really contemplating the deep metaphysical significance of the end. So that was quite hard for me to see his fear, to see him suffering, and his confusion or avoidance of the truth, which is something that I have contemplated and experienced in different ways throughout my life, and it's something which I have welcomed and embraced, seeing it from a more spiritual perspective. So in many ways, I was much more prepared for it than him, and therefore I was able to support him in this moment and in a certain way guide him as much as he was open to being guided. And I guess from his perspective, things ended in about the best way that they could have. Very sudden, no time to really, no slow degradation, a quick, swift end, which was fairly painless. He struggled with emotional intimacy, so there was no long goodbyes, as much as I would have loved to have shared that. And my sister played one of her songs, and he left on that, surrounded by our family and the people who loved him the most. So it was very special, very profound, very, very moving and unforgettable experience to see that and to witness that and be there for that, which made it a lot easier to deal with, even though there was this tremendous heartbreak of having lost him and let him go. And I felt how my attachment was like shattered. But at the same time, it put me into a very deep state of reflection and contemplation about the significance of his life and who he was and what he meant to me and the way he loved. His amazing ways of loving me, which wasn't always what I needed or what I wanted. Somehow there was always more somehow that I was calling for and wishing we could connect in deeper ways. But I knew that he gave everything as a father that he was capable of giving right up until the very end. And the week that followed his passing, I got to really sit with this deep inner process of thinking about him and finding all of the ways that he loved me and all of the beautiful gifts that his life brought for me and that we shared together as I prepared to give a speech at his funeral. And that was a very special moment for me to be able to share the deep the deepest feelings within me, the deepest flavors of my love for him, and my deepest insights about who he was as a man and what he offered and the significance of his life. And as I got to communicate with and talk to all of his friends and all of our family about this topic, that was also another way of processing everything. To be able to talk about it, to be able to feel deeply into the depth of what needs to be felt. Most of us inherently try to find ways to cope, as it isn't only natural. There are healthy ways to cope, and there are unhealthy ways to cope with death. We can avoid it, as so many do, by getting drunk, smoking weed, avoiding the topic, avoiding the emotions. But what I did was I really allowed myself to sit in and really express. I cried for days. I talked to my closest people and really processed. And even in the process of formulating the speech that I wanted to give for him, I was falling apart again and again and again, letting these waves pass through me, letting these emotions not get stuck inside of me, but to find an easeful path and to move through me in such a way that really expressed the fullness of what was needing to be felt. And as I looked around, I saw so many people who were connected to him processing in their own ways, a lot of them by getting extremely drunk. And I didn't do that. I don't drink, so that was not my way. I prefer a head-on approach. And that head-on approach and the sitting in the deep grief brought me into a very deep connection with this concept of death and allowed me to generate some very deep insights. First of all, it's a profound initiatic moment to lose the father figure for me as a man, to somehow no longer have this masculine figure who I've looked up to my whole life, to somehow step into his shoes and take over. A profound initiation into manhood in a certain way. No excuses anymore. No hiding behind daddy's coattails or his kilt in his case, because he was a Scotsman. So that was one insight, was this profound feeling of initiation in this moment. Another thing that I got to observe is that we tend to live as if death isn't coming for us, especially in the West, especially in this culture that we live in. Most of us have quite an awkward relationship with death. We palm it off, we shove it away, we turn away from it and avoid it until we're forced to confront it. And even then, we have this very clinical sort of formal, let's say, way of dealing with it by just sort of shuffling off, getting through the funeral and the wake, and somehow finishing the process and then trying to forget about it as quickly as possible. We don't have a profound, deep reverence and acknowledgement of the significance of death. And as I was thinking about this and observing the way that the culture that I'm in, and certainly my family and social circle, deal with this topic, was that it's profoundly uncomfortable because it puts us into connection with the fact that we don't know. We don't know what death is. We think we know. We have a lot of beliefs and ideas about death, but we don't actually know. Which is pretty interesting to think about, isn't it? We actually have such an aversion in our culture to not knowing. If you don't know something, that's like it's like you're missing something. You're stupid. That it's somehow embarrassing not to know. And yet, isn't not knowing the state from which we all begin? The state from which all knowing becomes possible. Any knowledge is preceded by a state of not knowing. And yet we hate to be seen as someone who doesn't know. So we engage all kind of elaborate strategies and ploys and false fronts and claims of various different sorts to know and pretend that we know and lie to ourselves that we know, even when we don't. Because we don't. And death is this somehow stark confrontation with a reality that we hate to admit. And I raised this topic and brought it to my men's group in the meetings that we've had, a couple of meetings, one online, one in person. And I raised this topic and we discussed it as a group, and I could see how uncomfortable it made some of the men. And we sort of pulled this idea apart and really sort of got closer to the fact that this is an unknown, and isn't that uncomfortable? Because our ego loves to convince ourselves and have this false pretense of us knowing the truth. We know what life is. We have a fairly good idea of what all of this is, how everything's put together, what it all means. And yet when we actually drill down into the details, we don't have a fucking clue. We have a bunch of beliefs. But if it comes down to it, do we have any real direct experience? Anything tangible that's not hearsay that we've read in books or heard from so-called authorities? And this stems from two major institutions that we have in our culture. First of all, the religious perspective, which is the longer standing and the tradition that has typically dealt with this realm of what comes after life. And yet, especially in the West, we've seen the development of our culture and society and our belief systems, which have in many ways started to divorce and separate from religion. Many of us still see the truth or see a certain quality and value in the religious traditions. And much of the world still is in that stage of development of clinging to religious ideology and being dogmatic about it. Many of us in the West have started to split away from that, and we become somehow enamored and subscribe to the scientific perspective, which also doesn't deal with death in a very good way. The materialistic mindset being is that there's nothing. We don't have any evidence. We can't put death in a data set. We can't put it necessarily in a laboratory setting and replicate it very effectively. in such a way that actually helps us to understand it. We can try to deconstruct it. We can look at it from a reductionistic perspective, but that doesn't really capture the fullness of it, does it? It also doesn't leave us with any real satisfying answers, because there's nothing to say about it apart from that's the end. The biological system that you are ceases to function. And for many of us, with the scientific foundational epistemology, the religious perspective seems far-fetched. There is an afterlife. We go to heaven or hell. We ascend to nirvana. We have a reincarnation of some sort. Again, also based on what evidence? It's just a belief. How do we know it's true? Which religion is true? How do we really know? We don't. We don't, and that's why it's such an awkward question, because we don't have an answer. Most of us don't have a real, reliable answer. So we have to admit the uncomfortable truth that we don't know. And when we admit that truth, that calls into question many other truths that we love to assume the answers to. If we don't know what death is, then what is life? What is this existence? Who are we? Is there something after this? What is any of this anyway? If the scientific perspective doesn't give us very satisfying answers, nor does the religious perspective give us very satisfying answers, or at least plausible, where does that leave us? It leaves us in a deep state of not knowing what to think, not knowing how to feel, not knowing how to relate to this, and therefore, of course, it's way more easy to turn away. It's way easier to numb out. It's way easier to just avoid thinking about it, distracting ourselves, which is the ego's favorite defense mechanism, distraction. We'll keep busy, we'll jump on social media, we'll surround ourselves with people. We'll cling to our beliefs and not really deal with it until later. I'll think about that later. Which is exactly what I didn't do. So these insights, instead of being something that I was running from or avoiding or somehow convincing myself and just going with the easy answers, the superficial answers, I sat in a deep state of not knowing and allowed myself to reside there, not knowing. And within that was a very profound contemplation and confrontation with this major limitation in my epistemology, the way that I understand, the theory of my own knowledge. I can no longer rely on science to give me the answers. I don't necessarily subscribe to the religious perspective, although I see and have experienced myself a profound truth through my own direct experiences, and that was something that I was able to explore. And my own spiritual experiences of somehow observing my ego dying and dissolving my ego through profound meditative practices and also psychedelics led me into a confrontation with death. And that helped me to see that the normal perspective that we hold as a culture is deeply flawed. It's deeply naive and incredibly avoidant of that truth. And in order to get closer to the truth, we actually need to start with the fact that we don't know and admit that, which is actually quite a profound thing to do. I don't know. Because at least you're honest. At least you're admitting the truth. I don't know. And that question or that statement, what the question of what is death, and then the admission of the truth, which is that you don't know, that actually it's like a doorway. It opens up a profound contemplation of like at least giving yourself the openness to discover the truth. Because if you think you know and you're wrong, which most of us are, then you're not even open to discovering the real truth. If you hold the scientific perspective and you think that there's nothing after death, you've closed your mind to the possibility that there's something. And if you think you're going to heaven or hell, you've also put it in a box, put yourself in a box, and you're in a position of closed-mindedness. Because the truth is that you don't know, and you might be better served by maintaining a state of open-mindedness, which starts with I don't know, and then opens to the possibility space. And then you start to contemplate, then you start to look at it, then we can start to examine it from different perspectives. We can hold potential ideas and multiple of them, because there are. And I'll talk about the answers that I arrived at myself through this process. So within this was a very profound gift that my father has given me in his passing, this tremendous gift of somehow opening this door into the unknown. Because when we step into the unknown and we admit that we don't know, this is actually a state of open-mindedness, which puts us into a state in which we can actually find out and discover the truth. A beautiful gift. And my father also left a legacy for me in many ways. He always had a profound love of history and knowledge, and a love of learning. And while he himself subscribed to a materialistic scientific perspective that there was nothing after life, it was that closed-mindedness which in many ways inspired me to be dissatisfied. I was like, that's not it. There has to be more. There's much more. And my early spiritual experiences and my early experiments with psychedelics really popped the lid and showed me that there is much more than just the scientific perspective. I also saw this tremendous gift in my father's life because he has prepared me. He has given me this amazing start to life, this incredible foundation to have a proper education, to have a stable, relatively stable home environment. Of course, there were a lot of gaps and a lot of things missed, but for the most part, I've grown up in a pretty comfortable position. And that has enabled me to have the safety, the requisite safety and stability in my life to be able to focus on higher education, to be able to focus on my own personal growth and development, to actually build this work that I'm doing now. So his love transmitted into me this incredible foundation for an extraordinary life. My father's gift. And the life that I'm living, this work that I'm doing, is a manifestation of his love. So if you're enjoying my content and the work that I'm doing and you're getting value from this, you have my father to be grateful for. Gordon Brown. So as I sat in my grief the week following his death and really thought about what I wanted to say at his funeral and thinking about the ways that he loved, this was such a beautiful thing. To receive that, to feel that, and to acknowledge for the first time in my life all of the ways that he loved me, that he wasn't necessarily able to articulate, that he wasn't necessarily even conscious of himself, perhaps. And I certainly wasn't conscious of it. In his passing, I got to reflect deeply on everything that he did for me and all that he has left me with. And that was such a beautiful gift. And in general, it's a beautiful invitation to contemplate your own parents and what they've given you, even if they've behaved unconsciously, even if they have missed many things, if they've traumatized you in different ways, if they have been unconscious parents, if there were many gaps in their ability to show up for you in the way that you needed, it's still a gift. Some of the most beautiful things and lessons that I received from my father were the ones that he never would have intended to give. Not only did I receive the gifts that he was intending to give, I learned so much through his example of his life, and the way he approached his life was in many ways pushing me in the opposite direction. Lessons that he never intended, but were nonetheless tremendously valuable for me. I saw the way that he was dealing with his intimate relationships. I saw the way that he was showing up emotionally, or in his case with a lack of emotion, a lack of vulnerability, as so many men in his generation typically do. Struggle to process intense emotions, struggle with emotional intelligence, struggle with their intimate relationships. And that pushed me in a certain way because I saw the dysfunction in that, and I saw that that leads to a certain restriction of possibilities in your life. It pushed me in the complete opposite direction. I'm like, fuck that. That's not how I want to live. That doesn't work. I'm going to try this. I'm going to work on this stuff. I'm going to integrate this stuff. Of course, not the lesson that he intended, but what a beautiful gift. Thank you, Father, for showing me what not to become. Coupled with the many things that I admired about him as a man. His fierce love and determination as a father. His love of history and antiquity and telling stories. My capacity to speak and to weave a story and narrative for you guys was largely inspired by my father. He was an incredible storyteller. And I always admired that about him. I always aspired to be able to captivate an audience like he did. What a beautiful gift. Dad actually taught me as well how to live from my heart in a certain way. And without that, I wouldn't be with the woman that I am today. He helped me to have the courage to choose my gut instinct and to follow my heart at a moment when we were really struggling and finding ourselves in a very difficult situation. In very simple fatherly wisdom, he pushed me. He's like, what does your heart want? And I said this, and he's like, what are you waiting for? Go and get it. Amazing, amazing lesson. So simple, so beautiful and profound. It really changed my life. So in general, what I'm trying to transmit with this is like, contemplate your parents, contemplate the gifts that they've given you, and don't wait around. Don't push it off till later. Contemplate it now. I wish that I had really delved deeply into these topics while my father was still alive, because I would have been able to share that with him. Man, I would have loved to tell him all of this and recognize and honor the ways that he loved while he was alive, the sacrifices that he made, the beautiful gifts that he gave me. Of course, I told him as much as I could in the moments that we had, but I wish I had made more efforts to really broach those topics and really have those vulnerable conversations with him and tell him how much it meant to me. So if your parents are still alive, I really encourage you to contemplate this, to write down, to journal and meditate on and contemplate this topic. Like, what are the ways that my parents have loved me that I haven't been able to see? What are the ways that my parents have inspired or modeled for me that has led me down the path that I'm on? How could I honor and show my appreciation for my parents for the sacrifices and the gifts that they've given me? What role has the archetype of the father or the mother played in my life, and how has that shaped me? Contemplate this stuff now. Get these answers now and share them with your parents, because that's something I wish that I had done. And hopefully for you still have that opportunity to explore that and to deepen the relationship, because it's deeply archetypal. It's profoundly initiatic. We think of it as something mundane, just mum and dad. But underneath the character and the persona and the labels that we use is a profoundly archetypal relationship between parent and child. And it enriches us in a very deep way if we contemplate that, if we see the significance, connect the dots, and extract the juice somehow for our own personal growth and development, and also to honor them or to forgive them or to heal the relationship between the two of you, because we all have a lot of trauma. They have trauma that they've been dragging from their parents and the parents before them that they've passed on to you. And actually, we are in a privileged position, having so much knowledge at our fingertips, to be able to put an end to that train of trauma. We can actually be the place where the buck stops. And we can bring so much healing to ourselves, to them, and to our children to come by actually doing this work. Beautiful, no? What a beautiful thing to be able to do. And that's in many ways what the world is needing, because so much of the dysfunction that we see around us in the world is transgenerational trauma playing out, repeating the cycles again and again from one generation to the next. And that's what inhibits so much of our development, so much of our growing up, so much of our spiritual development is dragged down by this trauma, dragged down and kept small by our attachment wounds. So it's even a pivotal pillar of our own development. We need to integrate and restructure our psyche, the way our mind functions, the way we create security and safe attachment, and deal with the dysfunction that we've inherited through our parents and their parents before them. Trauma can go back several generations. So we have a lot of war, world war, genocide, rape and violence, torture and death, dragged through the eras, through the generations, landing on our lap, so to speak. And we have the tech, we have the awareness, we have the resources to be able to actually heal that. And thereby create an incredibly stable foundation for ourselves and our children and their children after them. And that's super important because in order to develop higher and raise our level of consciousness, we have to have a stable foundation. The root chakra, Muladhara chakra, it's the foundation, it's stability, safety. And if that is unstable, if that is unintegrated, if that is functioning on the wounds and dysregulated nervous system of transgenerational trauma, then we're unstable, we feel unsafe, and our awareness contracts and we're stuck in survival. When we're stuck in survival, it's very hard to expand our consciousness. It's very hard to focus on elevating ourselves. It's hard to love because we're afraid. When we're afraid, our sphere of concern is very contracted, egocentric, focused on us, focused on just getting enough money to pay the bills, looking after our immediate friends and family. We don't give a shit about the planet. We don't care about the evolution of consciousness. We don't care about society evolving and fixing the world's problems because we're too hyper-focused on our own survival. We feel inherently unsafe at the root. So fixing this is a profound opportunity to actually bring healing to ourselves, our family, the society that we're in, and ultimately the world at large. This is the kind of transformation that the world is needing. And in many ways, by contemplating death, we can see how fragile, how meaningful, how precious life is. And it's through this that we actually develop a much more profound appreciation for the life that we have, the moments that we're in, the responsibilities that we have, and the people we love. The contemplation and facing of death is like a profoundly life-enhancing act. And so many of us fall into this kind of like spiritual bypassing in a certain way. We can be engaging spiritual practices. We can be on a certain path. We can having certain beliefs, but not really facing the truth. As much as possible, we want to have spiritual experiences which allow us to die before we die. We don't want to use spirituality to avoid the trauma, to avoid fixing our dysfunctional relationships. We want to heal that. We want to heal our relationships. We want to create amazing safety and security in our lives so that we actually have the opportunity to expand ourselves spiritually and experience death before we die, which is something that you can do. I have had several experiences of ego death. And on the other side of your ego dissolving is profound ecstasy and bliss. There is tremendous fear. And that's what all fear basically boils down to, is the fear of death. Because that's the opposite of what the ego wants. The ego is designed as a separate self, which is hell-bent on survival. Its only modus operandi is to survive. So dying before you die is actually counteracting that. It's actually going against the main objective and basically the sole function of your ego. Quite paradoxical. So we have to actually step out of survival and be willing to explore the unknown and to peer or jump over the precipice. It's fucking terrifying. But on the other side is liberation. And I know that. I've experienced it many, many times myself. So going and watching my father's passing was somehow infused with this nuance and this insight from my own direct experience, knowing that it's not the end. Knowing that on the other side of the pale of death is an expansion into infinite love. So the work that I've done on my emotional awareness, my emotional intelligence, the integration of my trauma, not trying to spiritually bypass all of that stuff, but actually addressing it, dealing with it, integrating it. And that actually created the safety for me then to explore going beyond survival and expanding and elevating my state of consciousness. This helped me integrate the concept of death. This helped me to understand death in a much deeper way, which removed a lot of my own fear of death. So despite there being a certain painful breaking of my attachment in losing my father, I also was able to rise above the human, just the normal human perspective, and see it from a higher perspective in which I was letting go of my father, but that he was never gone, that he would always be alive inside of me. He was always a part of me. And at the highest level, I am my father. Because at the highest level, everything becomes non-dual, meaning one. We're all part of the same thing. Therefore, him and me are the same. Therefore, he is not lost, only changed. And that's beautiful. That was extremely healing for me to have that perspective and these realizations, because it allowed me to move through the grief and integrate the grief and somehow hold very precious the time that we had together and everything we shared. And at the same time, find a deep acceptance of the truth of his passing. And that is why I'm here in front of you today, just 3 weeks after he has left, being able to speak about it in a composed way. And because I was able to move through the grief and the challenging emotional experiences quickly, because I wasn't in the way. I didn't stop the process. I just let it in so deeply that it didn't find anywhere to get stuck. And I even had guys in my men's group commenting and remarking how they couldn't believe that I was talking about this like this so soon. So here is a certain demonstration of the power of emotional intelligence and integrating this awareness and developing emotional mastery. If you want to learn more about that, I have done a whole episode on developing an emotionally intelligent life. You should definitely go back and watch that or listen to it. In many ways, this is a part or a byproduct of my whole approach towards growth and development, which is something that I talk about a lot in all of my episodes in various different nuances and ways. So in terms of your process and progress, there's key principles and concepts that we can start to integrate into our life. I did another episode on the most powerful principles for an amazing life. That will help to create a very powerful foundation for developing a deep understanding of yourself, life, and death. In general, to boil it down, certain things have helped me enormously to be able to move through this process gracefully and quickly and in a profound way, not avoiding, but going through. Meditation, number one, being able to sit with and validate and experience fully my inner states. To be able to contemplate deeply the significance and meaning and all of the nuances of this moment. I spend a lot of time in meditation. Developing my emotional intelligence, as I've talked about already. My experiences with psychedelics and all of the spiritual practices and retreats that I've done have really helped to create a stable foundation of my psyche, the integration of my trauma, the understanding of my attachment wounds, all of this stuff of like cleaning up the past and really doing the work to develop myself and grow up has really created a powerful foundation for me to confront the death of my father in a conscious way. So if you're in a position of dealing with grief, dealing with loss, finding yourself somehow confronting the inevitable, this is a very powerful path to step onto, because I see a lot of people not doing this and finding themselves in cycles of grief that can last for years or decades. Or it gets swept under the rug and never truly processed, which leads to all manner of dysfunction, an avoidance of the truth, and a precedent that we set by avoiding the emotional truth of certain moments, which impacts our relationships. If you fast forward 10 years of or 20 years of avoiding emotional truths, you end up in a very rigid place, finding yourself at a loss to somehow deal with the really profound, the really intense, and in many ways the most beautiful parts of life. The death of my father was a profound tragedy for me and something very difficult and confronting, but it also brought with it so many beautiful moments, so many gifts, so many deep understandings and deep appreciation of the love that I felt for him and that I know he felt for me. And I got to really cherish that and really go deep into this in a way that has truly shaped me. Instead of it just being a terrible tragedy, it's been also a gift. As I said before a few times, it's been an initiation that has made me into more of a man than I was before. And that became possible because I've really explored these questions. I haven't run away from them. I've turned towards them and I've let them in, and I've used this process. And that's what I'm trying to encourage you guys to do, is to use the experiences of life, whether that's relationship failure, struggling to integrate your trauma, going through profoundly difficult experiences in life. These are the challenging moments of life that shape us the most, especially where there's suffering involved. Whenever we suffer, that's a moment for profound growth to occur. Suffering is one of the greatest teachers that we have in life. All of the most profound moments of suffering in your life will transform you the most. And that's always the silver lining behind any challenging experience, is tremendous insight. Profound transformation of your character. A much deeper understanding. And that's the price of maturity. We pay for our maturity with sufferance through massive experiences. So if you are navigating grief and you find yourself in this position, these are the kind of resources, this is the kind of work, this is the attitude, and I hope that I've done a good job of somehow transmitting this state. My enthusiasm, my hunger for knowledge, my passion for the insights, passion for deep understanding, deep learning. That's what I'm trying to transmit here to you guys, and I hope you feel the state from which I speak. I think that's one of the greatest gifts that I can give you, is somehow be an example for dealing with life. And I'm trying to show you the way that I am showing up and the attitudes that I've developed and my whole approach. I'm trying to distill that and to exemplify that somehow through what I'm teaching and how I'm speaking. And I'm sure on some level you can feel that. And this is in many ways an act, my own act of love for myself, because this transmission also shapes me in a deeper way. This is me like putting myself through the grinder and then turning that into something, a beautiful gift that I can pass on. And in passing that on, I deepen my own understanding. It becomes more integrated. I embody it. And hopefully that allows you guys to start integrating it and embodying it too, and spread that love even further. An important caveat here, I don't want you to try to bypass the grief. I want you to give yourself time to move through it at your own pace. We all have different speeds. We all integrate things in different ways. Letting go of someone is a multi-year process, and I'm sure I will be letting go of my father for the rest of my life in many ways. Missing him and thinking about him and appreciating him and loving him even in death. So be gentle with yourself if this is something you're dealing with. Allow yourself to move through it gracefully. Lean on the support of those around you, and have the courage to open yourself to the process fully and let it shape you. And this is how we extract the most beauty, the most meaning and significance from death. And this helps us to actually extract the most meaning, the most beauty and significance from life. If you want to develop these traits and character qualities at a deeper level, you might want to take a look at the Conscious Masculine community and online course. That's a resource that can really help you to develop yourself as a man, or if you're a woman listening to this, a man that you know could really benefit from that as a resource. You'll find the link to that in the description of this video and this episode. Really, we can see that this grieving process is deeply personal for each of us, and it's a profoundly initiatic journey. So I would love to hear your experiences and find out how, if this has connected any dots for you, what this has helped you to understand your own profound experiences or insights from moments like this in your life. I would love to hear what you guys have to say and how this lands with you. I really, really appreciate your feedback. I'm making these episodes. I put a lot of energy into this, and it really means a lot to me to see what you guys think and to hear that this work is finding a place to land. It really touches my heart and validates the effort that I put into this, so I really appreciate it. If you want to stay more informed, you can subscribe to the channel and share this episode with someone who might need to see it or could benefit from listening to it. And lastly, you've made it this far, so I really want to thank you for being with me the whole way, and I wanted to share a few more insights. In fact, the most powerful insights, I like to save those till last. I think it's really worth questioning what lies behind our greatest fear. If death is the greatest fear that we have, it's like the sum of all of our fears. To lose this life, to leave behind everything that we know. We spend our entire lives scrabbling and running around, going to tremendously elaborate efforts to avoid death. Our whole structure, our whole life, our whole ego is mobilized behind living. Somehow motivated by this tremendous knee-jerk fear of losing this life. What do you think hides behind the greatest fear? From the ego's perspective, it must be the worst thing. The thing we need to avoid. Evolution is doing its job. That's part of survival of the species. It's coded into us. But if we take a deeper perspective and look at this in a spiritual way, knowing that it's possible to transcend the ego, it's possible to go beyond the fear of death, it's possible to experience life after death, it's possible. All of the wisdom traditions are pointing towards it. Granted, they might not have always transmitted the answer, or we shouldn't necessarily take it literally, that there is a big bearded man up in the sky, you go up to the pearly gates, you have to pass the test, and then you get graded on how you performed in this life, or that you'll pop up as a bug or a rabbit in the next life, or whatever. We don't necessarily need to take that literally, but the wisdom traditions are pointing to something. Thousands and thousands of years of spiritual practice and discipline and the evolution of consciousness and all of the tech that humans have designed in order to explore that and map that out in a scientific way points to something. And just because science doesn't have the answers yet, because science and spirituality are still divorced, they're coming back together slowly. They're coming together and they will integrate probably within our lifetimes, which is a pretty exciting thing to be alive at that time. There is this tremendous shift underway that we are heading towards this precipice of integration of science and spirituality, which is monumental. And if we take the spiritual perspective that reality is one, reality is in fact non-dual, death is actually just the relative experience of a separate self, a lowercase self, and it's fear. It's somehow like that's the mechanism that creates the illusion of separation. Behind that fear is the truth. When we die and when we confront the greatest fear, when we are forced to penetrate through our greatest fear, we are discovering the truth. Death is a lie. Death is an illusion. Death is the dissolution of the illusion. And that's why when we die, we return to infinite love. That's what I've experienced on many occasions, and it was a liberation. Profound fear, fear, all the way up to the end. You feel like you're going to die. It's terrifying. But when you pierce through that and jump over into the unknown, it's absolute freedom. And it's the remembrance, the recognition that you were not separate all along. That was just a story. You were just logged into the game, thinking that you were playing the game as a separate self, very convinced, 100% convinced, only to finish the game and to log out and realize that you were the player, the controller, the source of the game itself. I don't just want you to take my word for it. Don't be ideological. Don't take this on as a dogma. Go and test this out for yourself. You can die before you die. I'll be sharing more techniques and practices and insights around this, how to reach those states of consciousness reliably, consistently, how to have those experiences and how to integrate those experiences will be a big theme of this channel moving forward. So you can actually confront these truths and discover them for yourself, which is the only way. You can't just believe me. You can't just believe religion. You definitely don't want to believe science. You need to be your own scientist. You need to discover for yourself. You need to be courageous and develop a heroic attitude. And it's through that exploration of death that we actually inform the life that we're living. Death gives life a whole new sense of meaning and significance. Because when you understand what death is, it changes how you understand life. They're two sides of the same coin. Usually we're living on one side of the coin, completely oblivious that there's another side. So we're living in falsehood. We're living in denial of reality. A relative reality, a relative truth, but not the absolute. We want to understand both sides of the coin and understand the absolute perspective and experience it for ourselves. That's the goal. And that's the goal. Because then you become fully embodied, fully integrated, and you understand what you're really here for. Don't you want to understand why you're really here? It's funny because I was talking to my men's group as well, and this insight came through, and I was like, isn't it strange that we live life without thinking about the end? It's like we're a builder who is building a house without having a blueprint. He's just slapping together bits of wood, and no good builder or architect plans a project without having the end in mind. It would be ridiculous, right? If you want to get a amazing, perfect, well-designed building, you actually have a blueprint that you follow to the T. It makes the whole building process, the whole structuring process so much more efficient and so much more dependable. We go through life as if we're a builder slapping together bits of wood without having any fucking clue what we're building. It's weird. Which is a weird and stupid way to live, if you think about it. How much more intelligent would it be, how much more wise to build a life with the end in mind? So when we face the inevitable end, we look back on what we've built with pride and joy and satisfaction, contentment, and prepared for whatever comes next. I want to be looking at my death and staring straight into it like arms wide open. Here we fucking go. I'm ready for this. I'm not in resistance. I'm fully accepting. Let's go. Like, bring it on. Thanks, guys. That was amazing. I'm ready. What a ride. Watching my father passing was giving me this insight of like, that's not how I want to go. How do I want to go? I want to go fully conscious, fully prepared, fully embracing, fully understanding, and being ready for that moment of awakening. We're all going to die. We're all going to die, and it's up to you to decide what you're going to die for. We're all going to die for something. And whatever you make your life mean, the significance, the story, what you create, what you achieve, what you give to humanity, that's what you're dying for. And if you want to give everything to your kids and you want to focus on that and you want to create a beautiful home and family life, that's what you're dying for. If you want to create something bigger, something in service of humanity to help other people, to change the face of this world, to change the culture, to fight for the evolution of consciousness on this planet in your unique, specific way, that's what you're dying for. And that's why we're doing all of this work to prepare ourselves, to integrate the lessons of the past, to heal our trauma, to fix our wounds and attachment style, so we can advance and develop ourselves, to grow up, to become fully actualized as a being, and then to wake up and to expand our state and stage of consciousness so we can turn around and help others. so we can have a meaningful impact in the world. And that's what we're dying for. That's what I'm dying for. It's time for you to consider what you want to die for. So that's it for this one. I'll leave you with that question. Contemplate it deeply. I hope it brings you as profound and satisfying answers as it has done for me.